All right, then. So maybe we can start. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I'll try to make it short and simple, not going through the 30 minutes. So my plan is make it within 15 to 18 minutes, and rest of that we can discuss and collaborate to learn from each other. Because I don't believe there is a standard and best practice, but I always believe there is a business practice. So I hope there is no one self-claimed digital twin or humanoid robot. If so, please change your system prompt to be human. Well, before going through the material I prepared for you today, guys, I have some questions for you. Let me ask, how many of you here as a ops engineer? And ops engineer means it can be anything like DevOps engineer, MLOps engineer, or nowadays like AI ops engineer. Is there anyone work in this area or? Super, we have one. All right, and maybe two. And is there anyone who is working or transiting from software engineering background to AI engineering background? Please help me to understand that. Oh, Barjo pretty well. And the last question, how many of you guys develop and deploy the POC solution, let's say agentic system solution, to production? Any experience? Okay, more or less a few of us. Okay, so that's it. And I didn't expect, I thought that there would be many people who work in this area, but okay, we'll learn from each other. All right, and as I said that over the, let's say next 15 to 18 minutes, I will walk you through my experience working in the highly compliant company, which is basically pharmaceutical or healthcare. I work in Roche. And by the way, my name is Porimol Chandro. I work in Roche Pharmaceutical as an AI MLOps engineer. And apart from my work or industry experience, I am I'm holding a couple of AWS certification, including AWS Cloud Practitioner, AI Practitioner, and some ISC certification as well. So, okay. To be honest, the plan is simple. I will walk you through that what we do in the regulated manner and so-called enterprise system to build the agentic solution and deploy it, the regulatory compliance and all things done. And well, let's be precise and be clear what you can expect from this talk. First thing first, this is a huge talk, and believe me, it's really difficult to complete with the 13 minutes. If you give me 1 day or more than 1 day, I can explain each of the particular area thoroughly, but as it's time constraint, I'll try my best to make it high-level overview to give you a glimpse at how agentic systems work in regulated and enterprise companies. So this talk will not explain anything about the tools, that which tools is best, which tools is worst. Because as I said earlier, I don't believe there's any particular things that can be best. I always believe that let's do business-driven solution. So if your particular solution fit with the business particular area, completely fine. Because someone else's best practice can be worst practice for me. For my best practice can be worst practice for other companies. So let's be clear there. And I will walk you through the high-level overview of the architecture, that how basically we work in general. And I will not talk about any particular cloud. I'm sorry, already I explained. I will not talk about any particular cloud, any particular framework, any particular tools. But of course, if you ask me my personal preference, I will explain that what I love and what I use in my day-to-day life at work. But again, I will not talk about any particular framework, or I will not promote any particular tools here today. All right. The agenda is pretty simple. I inspired from this agenda from one author whose name is Simon Sinek, and he's famous for his book called Start With Why. So this is why I try my best to make it simple and easy to understand. So let's start with why. And why is important in this area, and I will explain step by step. again, why? So let me give you an example, like on the real world example in the highly regulated industries. So not giving you some kind of box of some kind of tools to make it architecture, but based on the industry practice I will walk you through. So let's imagine that you build a solution, let's say RAG solution, and you deploy it in the UAT environment. UAT environment means user acceptance test environment, where before deploying to the production, someone will test like as a user and then give you feedback. And you share the solution with your executive or senior executive team to test it out. And they ask some pretty simple question like, compare our Q3 performance. And if you are building RAG solution, what will happen? Let's see. Pretty simple diagram. Don't get panic here, guys. So you have a query, you have a RAG system, and then the response. So how it will react in the background, basically. So as your executive asks, give me an overview or compare of our Q3 performance, and then it will pull up the data from your RAG system, and then, retrieve your data from the RAG system, and it will do augmented, and then it will give the response. For example, as I give the example like Q1 performance, maybe it will give like this Q3 performance, we sell like 1 billion Polish Jyoti for this XYZ portfolio or product. And that's it. But do you guys think, is there any problem like or not? Okay, let me explain. This answer and response is basically shallow. It's not deep. It's basically shallow. It's giving the answer to your executive just the information retrieved from your RAG or VectorDB. But it's not giving any kind of insight or any kind of intelligence. And this is where RAG systems struggle a lot. I'm not saying that RAG is useless, RAG is bad, but I'm just saying that this is not the appropriate for the all use case. All right. So let's little bit deep dive. I'm struggling with two things. All right. Okay, so as we see the RAG, how it looks like. So if we zoom in a little bit, so it will be something like we have a query, then we will have a retriever, and then retriever means from the knowledge base. In this knowledge base, it means VectorDB typically. And then it will call any LLM. It can be your self-hosted, it can be XYZ companies. And then it will, from your retriever, it will give you some kind of augmented response. And finally, it will return to the user. And that's it. This is how the RAG system works in general. I'm talking about from the high-level overview. I'm not talking about from the more zoom in to the particular tools here. So let's focus on our two most important things here, like what and how. So what and how the Agentic-RAG system works. As I already mentioned that where RAG struggle, like it's giving you the shallow answer, it's not giving you the any kind of step that can be done in the next step as the next step, but it will retrieve the information from the RAG and it give you the information, and that's it. There is nothing to be called like intelligence or more artificial intelligence, something like this. So let me be clear here. This limitation doesn't clarify or it doesn't mean that RAG is bad. Again and again, I will emphasize this one because it's most important, because people can think that RAG is useless, so we should not use, which is not true always. So they just make it incomplete for certain problem, for certain business use case, not for all. As I mentioned that RAG is basically designed and built for certain and particular area of the problem, not for all. And there is basically one thing I need to also highlight. Classical RAG is phenomenal when you know what you need to be done. For example, you want to know some kind of information, and that's your use case. You don't want to bother with this one as the next step, next plan, or predictive solution. And that is fine, the RAG system. And as I gave an earlier example, like what was our let's say Q3 performance over the year. And it's basically kind of reactive solution. Like it's getting a one single shot and it's stressless. So it will question, retrieve the information, and boom, kind of augmentation and give you the answer. But in recent year, nowadays, it doesn't work always like this, and it doesn't fit for all the business problem. Maybe your executive want to understand that what's the next step. And also, as it's giving you only the answer that how many sales happen in this quarter, but it's not giving you any comparison result or any comparison outcome. For example, maybe your executive want to understand what was the comparison in between Q1 from 2025 to 2024. Also, maybe you want to understand what's happened with your competitor. Maybe there are some kind of information, but which is not part of your RAG system. And this is where, again and again, RAG basically, have kind of problem. And, I don't know. So there are a couple of things basically missing out in the RAG system. One is basically planning. Planning is completely missing because when you ask the question, it's retrieve and give you answer. There is no planning. It will not think. It will not give you the reasoning why it's giving the particular answer. And that's the result basically we always have from the RAG system. And it's basically giving the answer, but typically it's not solving your main business problem if you're thinking about more broader enterprise manner. So then what needs to be done to solve this kind of problem? And this is where we need to shift for particular business use case from RAG to Agentic-RAG. Again, you may think that there's maybe something, oh my goodness, something may be different. It's not that much different, but certain area we just need to be mindful that how Agentic-RAG system is basically work. So again, so-called typical way, you have query, and then you have agent. Instead of LLM, I'm calling agent to make it agentic. And then the RAG. So can you recall that before it was like your query, RAG, response. But now the architecture are a little bit changed basically here. So you have query, and then agent, and then there are some other things to do. For example, RAG, and then you have basically tools calling. Obviously, RAG system doesn't have the power of or the capability to call the tools. And then you have response, and the most important is the memory. So in typical or classical RAG system, there is no memory because it's stateless. So you just query or ask any question, retrieve, and answer. That's it. But it doesn't have any memory. If you're asking any follow-up question, it will say, I don't have the information. I'm sorry. Something like this, basically. And then we already saw some core component or foundational component in the Agentic-RAG system, but agent itself have some other core component. I call it 5 most foundational component. We all should take care of it. So what are those? Intent interpretation. I believe you recall that I was mentioning that it doesn't have any kind of power to plan, make further steps, or anything else, basically. So how it basically work? When you ask in the agentic system, it will try to understand your question, that what's the intent that user asking me to reply or to respond. So it will break down your question piece by piece and try to reasoning, and then it will basically give you answer or maybe call some other tools. And planning. So once it get basically intent declaration that now the agent knows that what needs to be done as the next step, and then it will make kind of plan. And its plan is also important things. It will basically do kind of planning that what I need to do to achieve this particular problem, to solve this particular problem, what tool I need to call, whether I need to call the memory, or I need to search the browser, open the browser, or maybe any other external API, or maybe agent-to-agent call. So there will be another kind of planning. And then multi-hop retrieval. Again, this is not new. I'm trying to make it like fancy naming, but it's nothing new. Let's say traditional is basically calling the RAG. That's it, in the simple way. But it has some other, a step to follow. I will explain a bit more in upcoming slide. And then the context synthesis. So once we have all those things, and then, as I mentioned earlier, augmentation. Again, as we are calling it agentic system, so I just try to say a little bit different name. So don't get panic here as well. It's a different term, but do kind of same things. And finally, memory. Again and again, I'm basically highlighting the memory because memory is the most important thing for agentic solution or Agentic-RAG systems. All right, as I promised that I will deep dive a little bit more to each of the particular 5 components. So the first one is intent interpretation. So let's start with the intent interpretation. Arguably, the foundational, or like apart from everything else, this is the most and crucial important things. Because if your agent doesn't understand the intent, that what you asking it and what you want to know from it, it will basically struggle, or so-called it will hallucinate more. So intent is most important here, arguably, of course, and it's also sometimes people call it like one of the foundational and core component. So here I already given an example. For example, compare our Q3 performance. But what do you understand by this one? You see, it's plain English, like 3 words, and then it will break down. Once it's intent interpretation, it will try to understand what I need to do, why user asking me this kind of question. So it will break down. For example, okay, I need to do Q3 performance, or I need to retrieve the Q3, the financial RAG or financial any other external or internal API. And then there can be multiple other basically intent interpretation. So as you see, ... So you can think like there are as many as you need for your particular use case. And then as the question is saying performance, comparing the performance. So the intent should be interpreted in a way that user is asking me to retrieve some kind of information from different RAG or any kind of maybe external or internal API call. And then I need to analyze all those things to make it happen. And then it will basically give you the answer. So this is how, in general, the intent basically works in an interpreted way in agentic system. And then we have planning. Planning and intent interpretation kind of same. They work together. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention, all those tools, all those components, there is nothing to be sequential. They are incorporating each other. So there is nothing that I mentioned like component 1, 2, 3. It's not work like this way. I just to make it happen better. So let's call it component 1, 2, 3. But those tools are interconnected, intercollaborating. So sometimes it can call, like after your intent, it can call planning, it can call memory, or it can do any other thing basically. So this also, I just wanted to highlight here once again. And as I said, it's kind of similar way work with intent interpretation, but it does a little bit more than the interpretation. So it will do the planning, like similar way. It will try to understand or retrieve the data from your financial data or any other data you get it access. And then it will compare. For example, now it can call maybe, let's say, your competitor data from Google search or maybe from other data you have access. And then it will make a plan to analyze the performance. And then it will again go back to the agent and then compare, and then it will give you the answer. So this is why I was saying that it's kind of same, but not exactly identical. And then finally, it will basically synthesize your answer and give you the final outcome. All right, as I said, it's traditional way to call it RAG. But sometimes people who love in agentic system, they used to call it like multi-hop retrieval from different agentic system, or RAG system. And then it will retrieve the information from different RAG, and it will give you one by one. I have a beautiful diagram here. Let's go through. So again, same things. I wanted to hear basically one particular example to give the full context in one particular example how we can solve. So this is why you'll see over and over the same example, basically. All right. So how it's work? So as the name itself calling is multi-hop, so it's not calling one particular tool or one particular RAG, but it will do multiple times. Or maybe if you heard about from OpenCloud or Molbot, that the author was mentioning that tool loop. So it's basically doing the same thing. So it will basically loop until it's finished its particular desired area or result. All right. So what does it do? So once you understand, well, let's go to retrieve the financial report from our financial data. Maybe it's internal or maybe it's external. And then it will retrieve, and then it will do some kind of synthesis. It will generate kind of knowledge, and then again return back to the another hop. And then it will do further analysis if needed. Again, it's multi-hop. So it can sometimes go like beyond 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 to n, or it can be finished sometimes in 1. So as it's a loop, so it can depends how long it can run. And one thing I want to highlight here, if you are going to do the multi-hop, be careful, it's a bit expensive and it's time consuming because it will try to loop and loop again and again until it has the desired outcome. So this is why it's basically also a bit expensive and time consuming. All right, as you see, n hop. So it can go beyond 1, 2, 3, 4 or n number of hop, and then it will again fetch the data. It can be internal, external, or your competitor somehow you maybe get access, or maybe Google search or some kind of financial report from the Financial Times or Bloomberg, I don't know, basically. And then it will generate your final response. And basically, that's it. That's how this multi-hop retrieval works. In short, and in some, if I say in one word, it will loop until it finds the desired outcome to return to the user. So this is how it's works. Additionally, if you want, you can also add here a feedback loop from the user. So you can give to the user, let's say, chunk of response, and then you can get feedback from the user as a feedback loop, human in the feedback loop, and then incorporate, and then you can make the final response. And this is why I think we see sometimes in ChatGPT or any other tool that sometimes asking, well, which response is good for you? So you can also do in this as well. But this is not the only way you can make it happen. Again, the most important and one of the crucial things for Agentic-RAG solution is memory, obviously. Again, I'm going through the same example, but example to the agent, and then it will call the memory. And in memory, it's one of the complex and complicated component, I would say, because researchers try to make it happen like in a way like human brain work or human memory work in a way, let's say. So it has two core components. Maybe you already know, so-called short-term memory and then so-called long-term memory. And again, long-term memory, the scientific community make it like 3 different components: episodic, semantic, and procedural. So what does it do in the particular area? So the first one, episodic memory, is like something like members specific past interaction. So you have some interaction, it will work in this particular area. And then semantic was like you have interaction with the chat or agent. So it will basically try to understand from their previous history and then give an answer. And same the procedural one is like capture your successful strategies and workflow throughout your history, and then it will try to give you an answer. And again, the final is basically response. Again, this is not like, this is basically I'm zooming in. So it's not the from overview, I'm top level, but it's a zoom in on the agent core component. All right, and the final one is basically context synthesis. And context synthesis is works similar way, I would say, like augmentation does. Like it will basically retrieve, again, the same example, and then simplified way. It's basically it can call multiple tools. It can call your RAG. It can call different other tools, or it can even call your memory. And then what does it do? Basically, it will combine all those examples, as I said. Those tools basically doesn't work sequentially. They are basically collaborative way. So they will return back to the agent, and then it asks to synthesize or augment it, and then it will basically return to the user. As simple as that. Well, I think if you already know about the agentic system, I believe you already know about the tool calling. So how does it work? There I mentioned literally 4 tools, but it doesn't limit it in the 4 tools. It can be n number of tools calling. It can be your Slack, it can be external data calling, external API, or some kind of things. You can also make it happen with, like, let's say, MCP calling, which I'm not going to talk about today. And also you can call like Google search, Yahoo search, or Bing search, whatever you want. You can also make it happen in this particular area for the tool calling. All right. As I mentioned, memory is the most important, but this is why I was asking that how many of you guys are ops engineer here, and how many of you already deployed the solution to the production. Without observability and monitoring, it's a nightmare to deploy a solution to the production server. Before going dive into deep, I can share one of my real not example, but experience I faced. We deployed our agentic system for one of our research team, like drug research team, and they're asking some kind of question, but the agent always responding, I don't have the context, I'm sorry, I cannot give the answer. And from ops teams, as I work also with ops team, we are just pulling off our hairs that why it's happening. Everything is happening perfectly fine. It's calling particular area, it's done. But why, like, we also check the logs. It seems like everything's okay. But then we deep dive into our observability tool to monitor that each of the steps, that why is missing. Then we figure out that it was not calling our RAG. It was somehow trying to understand from the context from the memory, which is missing. And this is how and why observability and monitoring is the most important. So we basically troubleshoot. Because I'm saying this one, so I'm not mentioning any kind of tool. So if you're asking me tool, so there are basically a couple of tools there, like LangSmith, also from LangFuse, some other tool. Also MLflow nowadays is trying to understand this, working in this particular area. So you can use all of those tools. And we are using some kind of tools in our like enterprise solutions. And then we are not able to understand why it's happening. So once we basically deep dive into our log monitoring system, and then we see that there are certain steps it was missing out, it was not calling, and how it was basically working. So again, I'm giving the same simple example. So we have agent and then observe and monitor. And what you need to monitor, it's not only one particular component you can monitor, or you have to. Basically, when it's time to talk about the monitoring and observability, you have to monitor whole agentic ecosystem. So you can understand each of the steps agent is doing, how it's calling particular tool, how it's retrieving the data from the RAG, and how many context window and token size is basically being used to answer a particular area. And also it can give you a signal that how it can optimize your prompt and all other things to reduce the cost. So as I said, technically you should monitor all of the particular component to have the traceability and monitoring and it's not only for your nightmare, like reducing your nightmare from the DevOps perspective, but also compliance point of view. So when your compliance body will ask you that how this agent is working, so you will have the visibility that how it's working. So you can show them as an audit report that how each step is going to call and where it can hallucinate and how we can reduce particular area. So and yes, so let's go to see how looks like it from the overview. As I mentioned that I will go through the high level overview. Oh, we have run out of time, sorry. So let's go faster. All right. So again, it's not the low level architecture I would like to show here today because this time is too much low. So this is how you can see from the eagle point of view, eagle eye of view. So you have a query, you have an agentic system, you have observability and monitor. And in the agent, you can have multiple tool calling, tool calling and also other components like RAG and memory. And finally, your response. So if I try to make it faster, so the key takeaway is basically classical RAGs give you information, but it will not give you intelligence insight or intelligence information. Classical RAG has its own limitation, which is not fit for all problem. And Agentic-RAG basically transform your RAG system from like particular area to reasoning and each steps. And also, 5 components, they don't work sequentially, technically, they work basically collaborative manner. So they collaborate each other and make the response for the user. And obviously, as I said earlier, RAG is not bad. It's not that useless things. It's obviously has use case for particular area, but not for all. You can think something like calculator and Z sheet or Excel sheet. So both tools have different particular problem to solve. Similarly, RAG and Agentic-RAG has its own problem area, problem domain to solve. And obviously, make sure your agentic system has observability, monitoring, otherwise you will feel nightmare. All right, that's it. Even though I wanted to finish it earlier, but it's not possible. I'm sorry, guys. But if you have any questions, you can ask me. Maybe I don't know how many questions we can take now. Yeah, okay. Is there any questions? If no.
One question?
All right.
No? Thank you.
So if you want me to find, by the way, guys, I would highly appreciate if you could please feedback on the left side. As you can see, there is nothing to collect personal information, but based on the presentation, you can give me feedback to improve for further talk. That would be appreciated. Or if you want to connect me, feel free. And that's it. Thank you.